The operating room at Briar Ridge General smelled like cold metal and burnt coffee, and at 3:07 in the morning, it smelled like someone was about to die. The patient's name was Gerald Foss, 53 years old, father of two. He'd come in through emergency 40 minutes earlier with what the intake nurse logged as possible cardiac event, which was the polite way of saying his heart had been trying to quit for the better part of an hour and nobody upstairs had figured out why. By the time the second attending got paged, Gerald Foss had already coded twice. The charge nurse on the floor that night was a woman named Elise Bouchard. She was 31 years old, originally from Rimouski, and she had been working nights at Briar Ridge for 3 years, without once being asked her opinion on anything that mattered. She had dark circles under her eyes that never fully went away, and a hospital ID badge that read RN float staff, which was the institutional way of saying she was borrowed, temporary, not quite belonging to any one department. The kind of nurse people walked past without noticing. That night, people would notice her. But not yet. The surgical suite on the 4th floor had the particular quality of controlled panic. Machines beeping at frequencies that made the back teeth ache. 3 residents hovering near the door like they weren't sure whether to step in or run. And one very loud, very important man standing at the head of the OR table demanding to know where Dr. Kellerman was. That man was Chief of Surgery Dr. Warren Stahl, 60 years old, salt and pepper hair, the kind of jaw that photographed well for hospital fundraising rooms. He had been at Briar Ridge for 22 years, long enough that his name was on a wing of the building, and his opinions were treated like hospital policy even when they weren't. He asked where Kellerman was 3 times in under 90 seconds. Nobody answered him directly. The scrub tech muttered something about a page going unanswered. One of the residents looked at the floor. The perfusionist kept her eyes on her machine. Elise Bouchard was at the instrument table, checking a tray, when she said quietly, "Dr. Kellerman isn't coming, sir." Stahl turned to look at her. He had the expression of a man who had just noticed a piece of furniture speak. "I'm sorry?" "He left the building," Elise said. She didn't look up from the tray. 20 minutes ago. His car is gone from the lot." The room went very still. Gerald Foss's monitor shrieked. What nobody in that OR knew, what nobody at Briar Ridge General knew, because the file had been sealed at a level most hospital administrators didn't have clearance to imagine, was that Elise Bouchard had spent 4 years working as a trauma surgeon in the most unforgiving operating environments on the planet. She had done her MD at Laval, fast-tracked through residency, recruited at 26 by a Canadian Forces medical unit attached to a joint NATO operation she was never permitted to name publicly. She had performed surgery in field tents in temperatures that fogged the instruments. She had closed chest wounds by lantern light. She had learned to make decisions in seconds that other surgeons spent 20 minutes debating in the comfort of a sterile room. Then something had happened, something classified, something that had pulled her out of uniform and put her behind a desk in Ottawa for 8 months while people in suits decided what her future looked like. The details were sealed. What came out the other end was a woman who had quietly, without fanfare, taken a nursing position at a mid-sized Ontario hospital and started over. Not because she'd lost her skills, because she needed to disappear. She had not touched a scalpel in 2 years until tonight. Gerald Foss's aorta was failing. Elise knew it the moment she reviewed the imaging the resident had pulled up on the secondary monitor. A widening, a tear, the specific and unmistakable shadow of a type of dissection working its way through the vessel wall like a crack spreading through ice. The kind of thing that killed men like Gerald Foss in under an hour if you didn't go in and do something irreversible about it. Dr. Stahl was still demanding answers about Kellerman. "We need to page Dr. Osibonsus," one of the residents said. He was young, 28 maybe, with the kind of earnest panic that came from being trained well but untested. "Osibonsu is in Hamilton," said the other resident. "Briar or Hendricks. Briar is in an active case. Hendricks is 2 hours out." Stahl's voice cut through the noise. "Someone get me a cardiac surgeon in this building in the next 10 minutes, or we are losing this man." Elise looked at the monitor. She looked at Gerald Foss's face. Gray, slack, the particular stillness of a body that was no longer fighting, just waiting. She looked at his hands. There was a callus on his right palm, the kind that came from tools, from building things. She picked up the chart. His emergency contact was listed as Diane Foss' wife. Below that, in smaller text, 2 names. Kids, a girl named Sophie 12. A boy named Luke 9. She set the chart down. "I can do it," Elise said. The room didn't go still this time. It went the other kind of quiet, the confused kind, where people look at each other, trying to determine if they heard correctly. Dr. Stahl stared at her. "I'm sorry. You're the float nurse." "Yes. You're telling me you can perform aortic repair surgery." "I'm telling you he has approximately 40 minutes before the dissection reaches the pericardium, and there is nobody else in this building who can do what needs to be done." She held his gaze. "So yes, that's what I'm telling you." Stahl's expression moved through several things quickly: disbelief, irritation, and something underneath both of those that might have been fear. Not fear of her. Fear of Gerald Foss dying on his table while he stood there arguing. "You're a nurse," he said. "Right now," Elise said. "I'm the only option you have." She scrubbed in. Nobody stopped her. Stahl hadn't said yes, not in any formal documentable way, but he hadn't said no either. And in the space between those two things, Elise Bouchard moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times in circumstances far worse than this. The resident, his name was Dr. Tomasz Wierski, she'd learn later, bright kid from Sudbury, first year out of residency, stood beside her and did what she asked without once questioning how she knew what she was asking for. That was either trust or shock. She didn't have time to determine which. "Bovie," she said. The scrub tech hesitated for only a second before placing it in her hand. "Pressure?" she asked without looking up. 70/40, said the anesthesiologist, a woman named Dr. Ades Nwosu, whose voice was the steadiest thing in the room. Elise would think about that voice later, how it had felt like something to hold on to. "Keep him there. Don't let it drop below 60. She worked. The thing about aortic dissection, the thing that makes it different from almost everything else, is that it punishes hesitation. The vessel is under pressure. The tear is dynamic. Every second you spend deciding is a second the damage extends further, deeper, more irreversible. You don't get to think, you get to know, and then you get to act." Elise knew. Her hands moved with a stillness that had taken years to build, in places that would never appear on her resume. She found the tear, a ragged, ugly thing along the posterior wall of the descending aorta, the kind that made less experienced surgeons hesitate because there was nowhere clean to start. She didn't hesitate. "Suction," she said. The field cleared. "Clamp." She worked around the damage, not through it. The technique she used wasn't in any Canadian surgical textbook. It was something she'd adapted in a field hospital outside a city she couldn't name, when the conventional approach had been unavailable, and the patient had been running out of time at the same rate Gerald Foss was running out of time now. She'd been alone then too, just her and a corpsman named Bertrand, who'd learned to anticipate her hands. Here she had Dr. Wierski, who was doing remarkably well for someone who had no idea what was happening. "How are you doing that?" he asked quietly at one point. "Focus," she said. He focused. 41 minutes after Elise Bouchard first picked up a scalpel, in 2 years, Gerald Foss's heart rate stabilized. The tear was repaired. The dissection had been stopped at the ascending arch, clean margins, no further progression. Dr. Nwosu said, "Pressure's coming up." And then she said it again, differently. "Pressure's coming up," meaning, he's going to make it. Dr. Stahl didn't speak to Elise directly for the first 20 minutes after they closed. She saw him in the hallway outside the OR, talking to the hospital's legal counsel. A compact man named Byron Hughes, who had arrived with his badge and his expression at a speed that suggested he'd been somewhere close by, already waiting. She saw them look at her. She turned away. In the scrub room, she ran water over her hands and watched the pink swirl down the drain and thought about Rimouski. About her mother's kitchen, about the specific smell of Lake Rimouski in early October, which was nothing like the smell of a hospital at 3 a.m, and which she had not thought about in a very long time. Dr. Wierski found her there. He stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure how to begin, and then he said, "He's stable. They're taking him to ICU." Good, Elise said. Who are you? Wiersky asked. It wasn't aggressive. It was genuine. The question of someone who had just watched something that didn't fit any category he'd been given. She dried her hands. Float staff, she said. Bouchard. I'm on until 7. He shook his head slowly. That's not what I mean. She looked at him for a moment. He had honest eyes, the kind that would make him a good doctor, eventually. Get some sleep when you can, she said. It's a long shift. She walked past him. At 4:45 in the morning, Dr. Stahl found her at the nursing station on the 4th floor, charting. He sat down across from her, not the posture of someone about to thank her. The posture of someone who had been coached. Ms. Bouchard. He folded his hands on the desk. I need you to understand that what happened tonight saved his life, she said, without looking up from the chart. A pause. What you did was outside your scope of practice. What I did was the only procedure available to that patient in the time he had remaining. She turned a page. I'd do it again. Stahl's jaw tightened. You performed surgery without authorization, without credentials verified by this institution. Have you reached Dr. Kellerman yet? She asked. He stopped. She looked up for the first time. The physician who was supposed to be in that OR, who left the building while a patient was coding. Have you reached him? The silence that followed was longer than the question deserved. That's a separate matter, Stahl said finally. Is it? She held his gaze. Gerald Foss is in ICU right now, stable, because someone stayed. I'd like to understand which part of that is a problem. Stahl leaned forward. I am the chief of surgery at this hospital, and I am telling you that your nursing certification is at risk. The college will be notified. There will be a review. Yes, Elise said. I expect there will be. She went back to the chart. What Byron Hughes and Dr. Stahl did not know. What they could not have known, because the relevant documentation was sealed behind 3 levels of federal classification, and a memorandum that technically did not exist, was that Elise Bouchard's nursing certification was not the only piece of paper she held. Her surgical license had been suspended, not revoked. The distinction mattered enormously. It had been suspended, temporarily, conditionally, at her own request, while an investigation concluded. An investigation into a medical event that had occurred during a deployment she was not permitted to discuss. The investigation had concluded 14 months ago, in her favor. The reinstatement paperwork was sitting in a folder in Ottawa, waiting for her to sign it. She had not signed it, because signing it meant coming back. And she hadn't been ready. She wasn't sure she was ready now. But Gerald Foss's chart was in front of her, and in the field for attending surgeon, someone, Dr. Wiersky, she suspected, had written a single line, procedure performed under emergency necessity by qualified medical personnel. She read it twice. At 6 in the morning, a woman came into the hospital. She was in her late 40s, still wearing the coat she'd grabbed off the hook by the door, gray cardigan underneath, boots that hadn't been fully laced. Her name was Diane Foss, and she had driven from Stony Creek to Briar Ridge in 45 minutes, because that was what happened when you got a phone call at 5:15 in the morning. A nurse took her to the ICU waiting room. Elise, who had no reason to be on that floor, and who had her coat and her bag and her car keys in her hand, stopped at the door. Diane Foss was sitting in a plastic chair, holding a cup of bad vending machine coffee with both hands, and she looked like every family member who had ever waited in a room like that, like someone who had rearranged their entire understanding of the next 20 years in the time it took to drive down the highway. Like someone who was waiting to find out what shape the rest of her life was going to take. Elise stood there for a moment. Then she sat down 2 chairs away. Your husband is stable, she said. He's going to need a few weeks of recovery. But the repair held. He's going to be okay. Diane Foss looked at her. Her eyes were red. She had the look of someone who had been trying very hard not to cry and was losing. Are you his doctor? She asked. Elise considered the question. I was there tonight, she said. That's all. Diane nodded slowly. She looked down at her coffee. Then she said, in a voice that was very small and very certain, Thank you. Elise didn't answer. She didn't trust her voice. She sat there for another few minutes, until the ICU attending came out and introduced himself to Diane. And she watched Diane's shoulders come down from her ears. And she thought about her own mother, and about Rimouski, and about a folder sitting in Ottawa with her name on the cover. She left before anyone could see her go. The review board convened 12 days later. It was not the kind of proceeding that made it into the news. Hospitals were careful about that, especially when the facts were complicated, and the outcome was alive and recovering in a rehab facility in Hamilton. But it was real, and it had consequences, and Elise Bouchard sat in a chair in front of 4 people and answered their questions without a lawyer, because she had decided she didn't want one. Dr. Stahl was not on the panel. He was, as it happened, otherwise occupied. The College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario had opened a separate inquiry into the conduct of Dr. Malcolm Kellerman, who had left a deteriorating patient without transferring care, without documentation, and whose whereabouts on the night in question had not initially been entirely clear. That inquiry was ongoing. That inquiry was not Elise's problem. The panel chair was a woman named Dr. Ruth Adichie, retired vascular surgeon, reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She had the manner of someone who had heard every possible version of every possible story and was waiting to hear this one. "Walk me through the decision," she said. Elise walked her through it. She was precise. She was clinical. She used the correct terminology for everything and did not editorialize and did not apologize. She described what she had seen, what she had assessed, what her options had been, and what she had done. She described the technique she had used and why the standard approach would not have worked in the time available. When she finished, there was a silence. Dr. Adichie took off her glasses and set them on the table. "You have a surgical license," she said. It wasn't a question. "Suspended," Elise said. "Not revoked, pending reinstatement." "Yes. And you've had that reinstatement available to you for over a year." "Yes." Dr. Adichie looked at her for a long moment. "Why haven't you signed the paperwork?" It was the one question Elise hadn't prepared for, because it was the one question she hadn't worked out an answer to herself. She was quiet for a moment. "I needed to be sure," she said finally, "that I was doing it for the right reason, not because someone needed me to, because I wanted to." Another silence. "And now?" Adichie asked. Elise thought about Diane Foss's hands around a cup of vending machine coffee, about the specific weight of a pair of surgical scissors when you hold them correctly, about Dr. Wiersky standing in a doorway asking, "Who are you?" "Now," she said, "I think I'm ready." The review concluded without a finding against Elise Bouchard. The formal language was careful and lawyerly and said several things at once, the way institutional language always does. But the substance of it was this. Under the circumstances that existed on the night in question, the actions taken were consistent with emergency medical necessity, and no disciplinary action would follow. Stahl did not issue a public statement. He issued a private one, through Hughes, which Elise received by email and read once and did not respond to. She signed the reinstatement paperwork the same afternoon. She didn't tell anyone. She mailed it back to Ottawa with the return envelope they'd included, which had been sitting unused in her kitchen drawer for 14 months. And then she made herself a cup of tea and sat at her kitchen table for a while. Outside her window, it was November in Ontario. That particular gray that settles in for months, the kind of light that flattens everything. The maples on her street were stripped bare. A neighbor's kid was trying to ride a bike on the wet sidewalk and kept wobbling and not quite falling. Her phone buzzed, a text from a number she didn't have saved. It said, "Heard what you did. Glad you were there. T. Wiersky." She looked at it for a long time. She typed back, "Get some sleep." Then she thought about it and added, "Good work that night." Then she put her phone face down on the table and drank her tea while it was still hot, which was something she had learned to do in places where hot tea was not always possible, and which she had never managed to make herself forget. 3 weeks after the review, a letter arrived from Briar Ridge General. It was not from Stahl. It was from the department head of cardiothoracic surgery, a woman named Dr. Patience Osei Bonsu, who had driven up from Hamilton the day after Gerald Foss was stabilized, who had reviewed the case file and spoken to Wiersky and Adeyes Nwosu and 3 of the OR staff, and who had then pulled Elise's personnel file and sat with it for a long afternoon. The letter was 1 page. It said that Briar Ridge General had an opening in its cardiothoracic fellowship program for the coming year. It said that the program had historically been competitive. It said that exceptions to standard application processes were rare but not unheard of, when the circumstances warranted. It said that Dr. Osi Bonsu would welcome a conversation if Elise was interested. Elise read the letter standing at her kitchen counter, still in her coat, bag over her shoulder, just home from a night shift. She read it again. She put it on the counter and made herself take off her coat and put down her bag and pour a glass of water before she let herself think about it. These were rules she had learned to live by. Don't make decisions before you've given yourself a minute to breathe. Don't answer the question before you know what's actually being asked. What was being asked, she thought, was whether she was done hiding. She thought about the OR at 3:07 in the morning. The specific smell, the specific quality of that silence when the monitor steadied. The way Wiersky had looked at her in the scrub room, not with suspicion, not with awe, but with the simple, unsettled recognition of someone who has just witnessed something true. She thought about two kids named Sophie and Luke, who were going to grow up with their father because she had stayed. She picked up her phone and found the number on the letterhead and dialed it. It rang twice. Dr. Osi Bonsu's office, said someone on the other end. This is Elise Bouchard, she said. I'm returning a call, and for the first time in 2 years, she didn't feel like she was hiding when she said it.